Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here and for the invitation from NIDA conference organizers and to get to speak to you for a few moments about my collaborative research on the critical challenges facing our times, including the climate crisis, deforestation, and other sustainable development goals. Before I begin, a couple of contextual points. First of all, it's always dangerous when you ask a professor who's been working on these issues for 30 years to only have 45 minutes. So I'll do my best to get through a lot of slides in 45 minutes that summarize what I'm doing. And I'm happy to share with you, free of charge, further publications and PowerPoints as a follow-up as well. Secondly, I am going to be a little provocative, and I think that speaks well for this conference. We've heard about the important impacts that economic globalization has had in lifting people out of poverty. We've also heard, though, about the unintended consequences of just focusing on economic growth. So I'm going to be provocative. I want to engage a conversation around, then, the world that I live in, around policy analysis, policy design, and policy pathways. So the provocation is for a purpose, which is that I believe the more we link our different academic lenses, and the more we link our practitioner experiences together, the more we can find innovative solutions for addressing the most important challenges facing our planet. So I'm going to begin by reflecting a little bit on the twin goals of globalization and sustainable development. Now, when we stand back and look at the academic literature and the practice of globalization and sustainable development, we discern two competing arguments in our work about how economic globalization affects, in some way, environmental and social problems. And I think if we're going to begin to design forward, we must reflect then on why there are competing arguments and what are the arguments about economic globalization. So the first argument about economic globalization is that it leads to improvements in lives and sustainability outcomes. The causal mechanisms behind this hypothesis, which is what it is, it's an important hypothesis, is that growth will alleviate poverty over time, and the alleviation of poverty enables populations to place greater emphasis on environmental concerns. So this kind of two-step process is behind a lot of the support for economic globalization. The second argument, however, is that economic globalization produces a race to the bottom concerning social and environmental standards. And the idea here is that countries often, the argument goes, relaxes their standards to compete for investment. And the more standards you have, the more costs associated with investment, and therefore the less capital you attract to promote growth. So which argument is right? Number one or number two? Which one's right? Well, it turns out, if we unpack this literature, each argument and the supporters of each argument point to very different empirical evidence in support of their arguments. So let's reflect on then the evidence for argument one. And let's think about poverty alleviation, which of course is SDG 1. And let's think about economic growth, SDG 8. And let's look at the empirical evidence on supporting this argument. Now, there's undeniably a strong correlation between economic growth and poverty alleviation. This graph summarizes, since 1972, the correlation between overall gross domestic product globally and the percent of populations not in poverty. So this is a good story linking economic globalization to poverty alleviation. A graph we know a lot about in our communities, and yesterday's panels nicely detailed these correlations. So very positive story in that regard. And even in Thailand, the same kind of idea. Significant increases in GDP corresponds with massive reductions in national poverty. So a really important and good story affecting the lives of people in Thailand, in Southeast Asia, and of course, the world. So there's no doubt the empirical evidence is strong for argument number one. But let's now turn to evidence for argument number two. Let's take, for example, global warming, which we're now increasingly calling global heating because of the way the projected impacts of global warming are now warming our planet to such an extent as witnessed by all of this year's fires across the world. So SDG 13, okay, let's look at that. Let's look at also marine species extinctions, which is covered in SDG 14. And let's look at land species extinctions covered in SDG 15. Here we have, as you know, a very different story. We know that CO2 emissions have coincided with increases in global temperatures, and that things are constantly getting worse, not better. Every year when I speak to my students for the last 30 years and I say, this year was the hottest year on record, I keep the same slide because the next year it's also the hottest year on record, right? And this is a problem we've been having for now 30 years. Likewise, we have dwindling, untouched forests. Forests that have not been touched by extractive industries is dwindling over time. And we know that tropical forest loss continues to increase over time, and the deforestation rate has not been reversed. And in Thailand, likewise, we know that tree cover loss is associated with a 12% decrease in land cover and associated release of carbon emissions. And of course, Thailand is not special. Countries all across the world are experiencing a similar phenomenon that reinforces argument number two. And then, of course, one troubling statistic is that we are now in the midst of the 6th great extinction of the planet, as most of you know. But this is the first one caused by Homo sapiens. Human beings have caused, in our behaviors, these extinctions that are ongoing. So, as you know, the pervasive impacts of climate change and these trends that reinforce argument number two are significant, from icebergs crashing to coral reefs bleaching to, of course, forest fires accelerating. And in fact, we know that climate and forests interact in these complex systems such that stopping deforestation would also help solve the climate crisis, but we're not doing either, as we have heard this morning from our Nobel laureate. And as we know, the more we go above 1.5 degrees warming, above pre-industrial levels, we know that catastrophic impacts will accelerate on our planet. We know all this. This is just evidence-based research supporting number two, hypothesis number two. So, which evidence do we point to? Which evidence do we draw on? How do we think about the contradictory evidence on the impacts of economic globalization? When we say, let's take an evidence-based approach, which evidence are we referring to when we decide to act and intervene in our world? And what does answering the question around what evidence we look to mean for efforts to re-globalize? What does this mean, then, by answering that question? And more importantly, how do we design for problems on which all sides, whether you're in argument number one, argument number two, wherever you are in that argument debate, all sides agree it must be better managed. So all sides do agree the climate crisis and the deforestation crisis, biodiversity crisis, must be addressed. No one's debating that. The question is, how do we do this, given the competing arguments about economic globalization? So I'm going to make the point then, these are actually critical questions right now, because today, unlike even 10 years ago, there is a discernible shift across the globe that treats the climate crisis as a top priority. And this is a unique and important shift, highlighted, of course, by the Paris Accords agreement that most countries have signed to limit warming above natural levels to no more than 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. And that's an accepted objective now around the climate crisis. And likewise, an agreement that when these transitions occur, they must be just. They must bring along the most disempowered and also those who are most in poverty as these transitions unfold. These are reinforced by commitments by most countries in Southeast Asia to generate peak emissions by 2030 and then by carbon neutrality by 2050. So these objectives are not up for debate. Both sides of the argument on economic globalization agree with these objectives. The question is, how do we design to achieve them, given the history we faced? So what's my argument then? Here's my argument. My argument is that how economic globalization impacts climate and deforestation is not preordained. It is not preordained. So one side and these arguments can point to different evidence, but the future evidence is not preordained. Door number one is a business as usual ongoing warming and deforestation story. Door number one, which would reflect the past. And door number two is the identification of re-globalization pathways that can effectively manage climate and deforestation. That's door number two. So I want to then, in my remaining time, and just so the organizers are aware, the wonderful little chart, the little screen showing my time that's remaining has disappeared. So I wouldn't mind getting that back on so I don't go over my time, okay? So a little shout out to the organizers. So the rest of this talk then is devoted to elaborating this argument about door number two, okay? So I'm going to cover a lot of stuff. I'm going to warn you, I'm going to cover a lot of stuff to make this argument because it's not simple stuff. It's actually quite complex, and I'm going to give you the gist, and happy to have more conversations with you after the talk. But are you ready? You ready for this? Okay, we're going to cover a lot of stuff. I'm warning you, it's going to be complex. Well, let's go. We're going to be on a roller coaster of ideas and information, so here we go on this roller coaster. Door number one looks like this. There are gaps between sustainability policy goals and outcomes persist. So we got these wonderful goals. SDGs are the latest in a long line of efforts to formalize these goals ever since Agenda 21 at the first Rio Earth Summit in '92. And then we have these largely short-term oriented policy interventions that emerge to address these goals. And then, of course, we have these suboptimal outcomes. So this is our story today about the argument number two, right? Door number one. Now, door number two, then, is the door around productive impacts in changing these outcomes. So how do we then close the gap between sustainability policy goals and outcomes such that we can make a difference? I'm going to argue that we can do that through generating fit-for-purpose policy pathways that you can start unfolding that can be in line with the problems that we're facing. And this, we expect then, will generate effective outcomes. And we're not doing this today very well on climate and deforestation and biodiversity loss. That's door number two, okay? But how to open door number two? So far, this is a simple talk. Now it's going to get very complicated because if door number two was easy to open, we wouldn't be sitting here today having these conversations. So I'm going to discuss then ideas for opening door number two, which requires all kinds of agency, all kinds of dot connecting across our disciplines and with practitioners to be effective. So I'm going to argue, based on our research and our collaborations, that there are 4 design steps for opening door number two. 4 different steps. The first step is that we need to be much clearer about the sustainability goals we are championing. And I'm going to argue and show you that there are not 1, but 4 competing problem conceptions out there about how to conceive of sustainability. And each problem conception withdraws and undermines the other problems. So we have to be very clear about the problems we're trying to address that we give priority to, and I'm going to walk you through that framework to make the case for being much clearer about what it is we want to achieve. And then the next step is to treat, I'm going to argue, climate and deforestation as type 4 super wicked problems that have very specific features that we must think about when designing for long-term effects. And then the fourth step is to design policy interventions for the long term through what we call bottom-up path dependency analysis, where we focus on policy lock-in so we can actually achieve our future goals versus always missing our targets. The fourth step I will not have time to review for you in any detail given the length of my talk, the time remaining in my talk, but I'm going to argue too that we can travel top-down global policy pathways that can help nurture these domestic bottom-up processes. And the nurturing pathways are important as a way to generate these bottom-up processes. So I'm going to focus on these first three, and I'll give you the fourth step free of charge after this conversation. But I'm going to argue if we follow these four steps, we can reverse the negative effects of economic globalization that the number two argument folks generate and critique globalization for. So first step. The first step is very important because it says we've got to begin and end by being much more careful about what are the ways we conceive of the problems we look at, and then the empirical evidence that we measure based on our problem conceptions. So that sounds kind of abstract, but this table teases that out. And this table emerged from me looking at the last 30 years of efforts I've been involved in to address sustainability challenges. And I realized that two questions could distinguish most of the academic work, the applied academic work, and practitioner efforts to build sustainability interventions. So one question was, does the designer, whether they're a scholar or whether they're a practitioner, does the policy designer think that chasing some kind of utility enhancement orientation is a good thing for the world? And you know the idea of utility being really important in economics, right? You enhance utility, you enhance economic welfare, you improve growth, and you improve society. So utility is an important concept for how do we improve human satisfactions of some kind. That's one question. Is utility the dominant frame for policy challenges? The second question is, does the policy designer, whether they're an academic or a practitioner, think about key features of the problem at hand on the ground? What are the key features of that problem represents that we would need to think about when designing to solve that problem? So on the ground, key features and utility are the two questions, and we get a 2x2 table. And all you political scientists in this room, you know very well that if you read any article, any journal in political science, you must have a 2x2 table. It's a normative influence. And I have this 2x2 table here, but it yields some interesting results about how we place ourselves. And as I'm talking, I want you to place yourselves in these categories and to see where do you fit. So type 1 sustainability conception is where you do think about utility as being important, but also the key features of the problem itself. So what does that mean in practice? This refers to all the work being done on the tragedy of the commons, made famous by Hardin and then Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom. And they both said, look, we're noticing that communities often over-harvest resources, be they fish or timber, more than the growth rate, such that over time, the resource itself is depleted, undermining the utility-enhancing benefits of harvesting fish or timber for either their communities or to sell in the marketplace. So Hardin and Ostrom spend years thinking about designing for these problems. And Elinor Ostrom wins the Nobel Prize in economics, in part for saying Hardin didn't get enough into the problem features on the ground. Because while trees sit on the ground and don't move, fish, it turns out, swim. And she said, because fish swim, you can't apply private property rights as a way to design to solve this problem. Instead, you need to have community-based governance at the local level, cooperative governance. And she spends 20 years designing to solve the problem of fisheries depletion that will, if successful, enhance utility, growth for fisheries in line with the yields that the reproduction rates produces. So this says the tragedy of the commons. It's really important for resource studies, but it's still around utility, human satisfactions as being important. So type 2 says, actually, let's not worry about the actual problem features, because our ultimate goal isn't utility for one good or one sector, it's overall economic utility for society as a whole, what economics call economic welfare, right? How do we enhance overall economic welfare? That should be our main goal, not solving one problem that if you do might actually undermine economic welfare. So this tells us then, this school, that if you want to solve the climate crisis, you've got to find a policy tool, a policy design, that will enhance overall economic welfare to solve the problem. There's an implicit bias in this school towards enhancing utility that narrows our problem solutions. We do this through cost-benefit analysis and other techniques to find out and identify policy options. And it's why another Nobel laureate, Nordhaus, my former colleague at Yale, argues that the optimal outcome that we can get for the climate crisis is not 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, it's 3.2. It's the only rational outcome. Now, he means rational in terms of enhancing economic welfare. So what happens, of course, is that others come along and say, economic welfare is very important, but it's not the only game in town. And that actually compromising among different goals is fundamental for generating sustainable development. And this is made famous by Brundtland in her 86 report, who argues that environment, social, and economic goals ought to be balanced in some way so that no one trumps the other. We pay attention to all those goals to create legitimate processes. And of course, this does wonderful things for reducing conflict, for creating peace and stability in society. That's a wonderful school, but doesn't always work for some problems. So the example I like to share is the example of Newfoundland in my home country of Canada. 25 years ago, Newfoundland fishers were harvesting too many cod above the depletion rate. And so the biologists went to the fishers and the government and said, hey, you're allowing too many cod to be caught, and you're going to have a collapse if you don't change your quotas. And so the government invoked a compromise multi-stakeholder process in Newfoundland, and they involved the workers, the fishers, indigenous communities, municipalities, federal, provincial ministers, and politicians, and they achieved a legitimate and trustable outcome that everybody felt good about because they listened to each other and developed a compromise solution. Only problem was that compromise solution was not in line with what the biologists said would need to be the solution to avoid catastrophic collapse. But guess what happened? Catastrophic collapse of the cod fishery for 25 years. So sometimes the compromise school doesn't work for problems that have to be given priority. Now, type 4 says, yeah, some problems like ostroms must be given attention based on their key features. They must be, but they're not utility-enhancing problems. They're actually problems that utility-enhancing behavior caused. So some problems are so important, we say, it doesn't matter about utility. We give them type 4 priority status. And in our worlds, we all know one that we give this status to, and it's anti-slavery norms. Anti-slavery norms are so strong, we would never say, let's have a compromise solution on slavery. Who can own slaves and who can't own slaves? That would undermine the very idea of a type 4 problem governing slavery. Nor would we ever do a cost-benefit analysis to see the pros and cons of slavery. Never, because that would undermine the type 4 identification we give slavery. So we do this all the time in our worlds, but we're not doing it for the climate crisis, and we're not doing it for deforestation. We're giving those type 3, 2, and 1 orientations when they really must be given type 4 priority status, as we've heard from our previous speaker and discussions yesterday. if we want to give climate change type 4 status, and the Paris Accord did that with a 1.5 2-degree goal, how do we do it? Okay? How do we do it? I'm going to give you some slides now to tell you how we do it, and again, I'll share the remaining slides with you afterwards, given that, the time that I have. But step 2 then says, okay, if you want to treat climate change and deforestation as type 2 problems, you better design for type 4, what we call super wicked problems. So let's think about climate change as a super wicked problem, and these graphs are to get your brain around this. Superman in a play in London, super wicked, okay? And by the way, evidence shows that, a month after my talk, you're going to forget my name, and in 6 months, you're going to forget what I said. Totally fine. This is what happens. Just don't forget these 2 words, super and wicked. If you see me in the streets a year from now, forget my name and just say super wicked guy, okay? Because my entire talk is around solving super wicked problems. And that's just 2 words. You can't forget 2 words, super and wicked. So what are these super wicked problems that we now know has been culminated in 30 years of efforts to address these problems, and yet we're getting warmer faster. We're having the opposite impact on super wicked problems. With my colleagues Levin, Bernstein, and Ald, we identified 4 key features for solving super wicked problems. The first is, like my talk right now, and I can see from that notification in the room that's now lit up, time is running out. Now, this distinguishes different classes of policy problems, because many policy problems, there's no issue of time running out. Gun control in the United States, you can keep going back to the policy process time and time again and trying to get your resolution to solve the gun control crisis. But on climate change or COVID, for example, you have to act soon or it's too late. And we know that carbon dioxide sits in the atmosphere for 300 years, and at some point it's too late to act, and we're going to have catastrophic tipping points that will impact all of us. And that means acting when you don't always have all the evidence, and acting at a scale commensurate with the problems. The second key feature is that those seeking to end the problem are also causing it. This is a debate with ourselves that we're having. I love to fly, go to conferences, it's a lot of fun. I also emit lots of carbon doing so. We're walking paradoxes, all of us. So how do we actually tend to our climate change interest selves and not as much our have fun, go traveling selves? How do we do this? In the psychology world on individual behavior, there's lots of techniques for this, governing smoking, those who want to stop smoking or exercising more, behavioral commitments that can actually focus on your long-term selves. But we need to do this for the policy process, not just individual selves, but our collective interests as well. Third key feature, policies discount the future irrationally. And by this we mean all the policies to date for the last 30 years have not been in line with the science of the problem that we're trying to solve. They're Newfoundland, right? Not in line with the science of the problem we're trying to solve. And then fourth, no central authority. No one place to go to solve and develop authoritative rules, which is why the Paris Accord doesn't have any, right, when it comes to on-the-ground behaviors. So what do we do then, step number 3, to identify policy design pathways consistent with super wicked problems? I'm going to give you this last, again, third pathway, one example, and then the rest I'll save for, and I'm invited back here next time. Okay, but this is a really important third step. How do you design for multiple step pathways for the long term? We think bottom-up path dependency analysis could provide an answer, or does provide an answer. So I want to give you this slide, because path dependency analysis thinks of policy over a series of steps, what we call progressive paradigmatic. We don't just do one thing and a result occurs. We follow a pathway that has different steps that each do things to achieve our goals. So how does the top right column work in that future we want to unfold over time? So the first question for path dependency analysis is then, how do you generate policy lock-in in some way when you design in the first step? How do you constrain your future self, just the way a smoker does the same thing for hiding his cigarettes in the future? How do you create, therefore, critical juncture moments where you design the policy where you can't backtrack? You're now committed to the long term. How do you do that? And then what are the easy-to-pull levers that are hard to reverse for doing that? Where do we find these levers we can pull? Becomes a really important question. So your other metaphor here is a ratcheting set. Where's the ratcheting set? We can't backtrack. We can only go forward. Where are they? So out of all this work, we thought about 4 diagnostic questions we can all think about when designing this way, these bottom-up pathways. Diagnostic question number 1, what can be done to create stickiness, making reversibility immediately difficult? What can we do for that? What can we do to entrench support over time once the policy is unleashed? What can be done to expand the population that supports the policy? Because you can imagine the policy diffuses out and out and out. It can have an effect globally, even if you haven't got a global convention on that policy. And then how can you design in a way that's consistent with the crisis that we're facing? So this table, I can't give you a huge lecture on, but it links the questions to the key features of super wicked problems. The point here is that we're thinking of the key features, like Ostrom did for commons tragedies. We're applying it to super wicked problems on the climate side, and then from that, we get diagnostic questions. So it's always related back to the key features of the problem at hand. But how are these applied in practice? This is all theory so far and concepts. I want to leave you with one example for you to think about in my remaining minute and a half. And it's an amazing example that comes to us from Germany. But my point is this German example can be applied time and time again in Southeast Asia, in the South, across the world, by making a difference for super wicked problems. So here's the story in a nutshell. About 15, 20 years ago, some very smart German government officials said, you know, there's this climate crisis. We've seen the Al Gore PowerPoint, we've read the IPCC reports, we're in trouble. Our population isn't quite there yet demanding us to act, but we know they will be in the future when this crisis gets worse. So how do we act now when the political feasibility dynamics are different than they will be in 10, 20 years when it's too late? So they designed a path-dependent policy mechanism around green technology, solar panels and wind farms. What did they do? They said, you know what? Instead of giving subsidies to German homeowners to put solar panels on the rooftops, which is the common practice as subsidy for green technology, we're going to create 20-year long-term contracts, and we're going to pay you back every year over 20 years for your cost of putting the solar panels on your rooftops. What did that do? That meant any future German government that wanted to change that policy, reverse backwards, would have to pay compensation costs to homeowners, increasing the cost to government, hence locking in that policy decision, locking it in initially. And then the government said, you know what? We're going to pay the retail rate, not the wholesale rate, for any excess energy that homeowners produce. Another little design tinker. What did that do? Germans who were first having this program started wearing jackets and coats because they made money economically by producing more energy than they consumed, right? So what happens? As more and more Germans make money, more and more Germans who aren't part of the program now lobby to demand the program. They didn't create it in the first place, their demand, but in step 2, they now lobby, I want this program too. My neighbors are making money. And the government says, sure. And they expand the program to other populations. But then it's great because now what happens? Companies emerge to produce the supply of green technology. And that created a different political support for the program that didn't exist in step 1, but step 3 now has companies reinforcing politically this program. What happens in step 4? Germans move from economically incentives for wearing jackets to now being ingrained culturally in their behaviors. And we know from the sociologists at some point in time, routinized behavior for economic reasons becomes culturally ingrained. And this is what happened in Germany. Such that now, if you don't have solar panels on your rooftop in Germany, you're not considered a good neighbor. This story gets even better. Because then what happens is, almost all Germans now have this program, the policy is expanded and entrenched, and other governments go, we like this program too. And they go to Germany, learn about it, and they copy this program and bring it to their own home governments despite no global convention. Today, 160 countries have mirrored this policy in some way. That's also helped to accelerate the lower costs of solar panels. Economists now predict that this one policy lever in Germany 15 years ago explains why all of our solar panels are cheaper than they otherwise would have been. Okay? That's one story, and my time's up, so I can't go through the rest of the details, but it's the one story to say the more we think about these questions and design this way over policy steps, the more we can own our future instead of being consumed by the responses to the frustrations we're all having around 30 years of well-intended but failed efforts to address the two most important environmental problems facing our planet, which are now also the two most human-focused problems facing our planet, too. So I'll stop there. Rest of the PowerPoint, free of charge. Just email me. I'm happy to send it to you. Thank you.